No one in that hospital corridor noticed the girl with the two big sneakers and the two quiet eyes, but I did, and perhaps if you stay with me, you will too, because hidden in her silence was a storm the world would one day reckon with. The doctors called her father a hopeless case, signed the chart, closed the file, and walked away, their footsteps echoing like the slam of a door she had not yet learned how to open. That was the moment her life fractured into before and after, though the white coats never thought to glance back at the child staring at them from the hallway bench, hands clenched so tight her nails left half-moons in her palms. If you believe no life should be written off as hopeless, then lean in, and don't forget to like this story and subscribe to hear more, because what you are about to witness is not simply a tale of science, but of stubborn defiance against a system that mistook quietness for weakness. Amara's mother, a nurse with calloused hands and a spine bowed by 12-hour shifts, had no time for her own grief. She pressed her lips together, tucked her daughter into the hospital cafeteria booth at night, and whispered that survival was its own rebellion. And so the little girl grew up inside fluorescent-lit corridors where death was routine and miracles were rationed, where charts stamped "end of care" seemed to target patients who looked far too much like her father, where nurses whispered compassion only to be overruled by doctors chasing statistics instead of humanity. To be clear, Amara was not remarkable in the way those doctors measured worth. She was small, thin, soft-spoken, sometimes mistaken for absent-minded when in truth she was memorizing the patterns of voices, the way physicians' tones shifted when speaking to white patients versus black ones, the way clipboards seemed heavier in her mother's hands than in anyone else's. And yet in that invisibility, she discovered her earliest laboratory, the staff break room, with its half-broken vending machine and discarded journals, the place she turned into a classroom no teacher ever sanctioned. She taught herself to trace medical diagrams with the same persistence she once used to trace the seams of her sneakers, and by 12 she could recite drug names like other kids memorized rap lyrics. I watched her sit at a scratched linoleum table under humming fluorescent bulbs, the smell of bleach and microwave noodles in the air, her mother's stethoscope a talisman in front of her, whispering the names of diseases as though naming them gave her power over them. By the time most children her age were learning fractions, Amara understood triage flowcharts and could spot which patients were quietly being abandoned beneath the word hopeless. She never forgot the way a doctor had once leaned over her father and said, almost kindly, "We've done everything we can." What they meant, she learned, was everything we are willing to do. From that moment forward, every chart she glimpsed felt like a battlefield, every discarded patient a ghost trailing her through the ward. Nights stretched into years, her mother working 2 jobs, her textbooks dog-eared and stained with cafeteria coffee, and always the chorus of authority around her insisting that the hierarchy was fixed. Nurses obeyed, doctors decided, patients submitted, and children like Amara disappeared in the margins. But Amara was not a margin. She was an accumulation, a relentless gathering of knowledge, a quiet recording of injustices no one else bothered to document. She learned the sound of ventilators cycling in the dark, the particular silence of a nurse who knows the crash cart won't arrive in time, the way grief can be disguised as efficiency when doctors pronounce death in under 10 seconds. And in that silence, she carried a vow, though she never spoke it aloud, that one day she would rewrite the word hopeless in letters the whole world would have to see. Still, childhood is long, and determination is often mistaken for daydreaming. Teachers marked her as distracted, peers called her weird, and even her mother worried she was carrying too much of the hospital's sorrow. But Amara only smiled faintly and tucked away the words, turning them into fuel. And I must tell you, though this is only the beginning, that what she began to build in those unnoticed nights, in the corners of rooms no one thought to sweep for brilliance, would one day shake the medical establishment to its core. Yet at that moment, she was still just a child with untied shoelaces, listening to the whisper of machines and memorizing the cadence of dismissals. Hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. Words meant to end a life became the ones that started hers. By the time Amara was 27, the hospital that had once been her mother's prison of double shifts and her childhood classroom of grief had become something else entirely. A proving ground where the young black woman no one had expected to survive the system now stood at the edge of rewriting its rules, though the system still did its best to pretend she was invisible. She had clawed her way through scholarships stitched together by sympathetic mentors, endured professors who insisted her questions were too political, and graduated with a doctorate in biomedical engineering by treating every sneer and every doubt as one more brick in the laboratory she carried inside her. The memory of her father's dismissal, hopeless, was the compass that guided her research. She would find a way to protect lives others had already written off. When the new respiratory virus swept through the city, its cruelty was familiar. Affluent neighborhoods found experimental treatments flown in overnight, while overcrowded wards in black and immigrant communities overflowed with bodies left gasping, waiting for a miracle that never came. Amara walked those wards as a volunteer, the stench of disinfectant barely masking the metallic tang of panic, and saw her mother's face in every nurse, her father's silence in every patient given little more than oxygen and pity. She carried those faces back to the university lab, where broken centrifuges and salvaged microscopes were all she had, and told her team, half a dozen students of color, unpaid, weary, and brilliant, that they were going to try anyway. They laughed at first, not because they didn't believe in her, but because the idea was audacious. To design a synthetic vaccine with tools discarded by wealthier labs, to compete with pharmaceutical giants who already saw the pandemic as profit. But Amara's conviction was contagious, and soon their nights blurred into dawns of scribbled formulas on whiteboards borrowed from abandoned classrooms, experiments run with second-hand reagents bought on clearance, data recorded in spreadsheets stained with coffee and determination. While the official institutions debated protocols and funding, Amara's team created something astonishing, a prototype that triggered immune responses at levels no one had predicted possible. It was not luck, but the culmination of years of invisible apprenticeship in hospital corridors, of noticing what others missed, of understanding that hopeless often meant unexplored. The first trials were quiet. Neighbors, family members, people with no other options. But when patients once marked for hospice began to recover, word spread faster than the virus itself. Videos surfaced online of grandmothers breathing freely again, of children regaining strength, and though the establishment dismissed them as anecdotes, the public knew what it saw: survival blooming where death had been promised. The very doctors who had ignored her as a child now demanded access to her data, circling her like vultures pretending to be doves, while medical boards tried to discredit her for skipping the traditional channels they had long used as gates. Unsafe, they called her work, as though letting people die quietly was somehow safer. But the pressure only sharpened her defiance. She released her methodology online for anyone to scrutinize, daring the world to test it, and within weeks labs across the globe were replicating her results. Suddenly, the impossible was undeniable. The nurse's daughter, the invisible child who had grown up beneath the humming lights of forgotten wards, had outpaced billion-dollar research facilities. And yet what mattered most to Amara was not the headlines or the grudging respect, but the moment she returned to the same hospital corridor where her father had been signed off as hopeless years before and saw a new patient, an elderly black man, frail but breathing steadily after her vaccine, smile at his daughter through tears. For Amara, that was the first true breakthrough. Not the science itself, but the proof that despair was not destiny, that survival could bloom even where the system had given up. It was a victory born not in sterile boardrooms, but in the stubborn heart of a girl who had refused to accept the word hopeless as the final word. The day the world finally knew her name was not in a laboratory or a classroom, but on the steps of a courthouse where cameras flashed like lightning and microphones bristled like spears, waiting for the woman the establishment had tried to ignore to explain how she had defied them. Amara, now 30 years old, stood before the frenzy with her mother at her side. The nurse who had once whispered survival as rebellion, now crying openly as her daughter prepared to tell the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Reporters shouted questions about patents, lawsuits, and profits, but Amara lifted her chin and spoke instead of patience. Of fathers written off too early, of grandmothers abandoned in hallways, of entire communities who had been taught to accept hopeless as their inheritance. She told them that her vaccine was not a miracle, but a refusal to believe that survival should depend on wealth or skin color, or whether a committee decided a life was still worth fighting for. Her words spread across screens and feeds in real time, and millions who had never heard of her before felt as though they had been waiting their entire lives to hear someone speak with such clarity. Governments scrambled to negotiate contracts, pharmaceutical companies filed injunctions, and yet none of them could stop the groundswell. Her vaccine was already being manufactured in underground labs, in converted school basements, in countries long ignored by global health initiatives, because she had given the formula away for free, daring the world to keep up. And though critics warned her that open science would ruin her career, Amara only smiled faintly, because she had never entered this war for career. What she wanted was change, and change was already happening. Hospitals that had once funneled resources away from marginalized neighborhoods now had to explain on live television why those same neighborhoods were the first to benefit from her discovery. Politicians who had once ignored her community now scrambled to be photographed beside her. Medical journals that had rejected her papers were subtly begging to publish her every word. But the real revolution was quieter, unfolding in classrooms where black and brown children, once discouraged from dreaming too big, now pointed at her picture in newspapers and whispered, "She looks like me." For Amara, that was worth more than any award. Yet victory did not come without fire. The same boards that had tried to silence her now dragged her into hearings, accusing her of reckless endangerment, of bypassing protocols, of undermining trust in institutions. She sat through hours of interrogation under fluorescent lights not unlike the ones she had studied beneath as a child, answering calmly, methodically, refusing to be rattled. When they asked her who had authorized her research, she said softly, "Every patient who was told they were hopeless." When they asked her what right she had to share her formula without permission, she answered, "The right of every daughter who has buried a father because someone thought his life wasn't worth the cost of another vial." And when they finally asked if she regretted anything, she looked straight into the cameras and said, "Only that my father did not live to see this day." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. That clip alone was replayed across the globe, turning hearings meant to disgrace her into sermons of defiance. Within a year, Amara's vaccine had been credited with saving more than 10 million lives, though she always insisted the true credit belonged to the patients who had risked being first, the mothers who had whispered prayers over their children, the communities who had volunteered not because they trusted the system, but because they trusted her. She became a symbol, though she never asked to be one. And with every award ceremony, every keynote speech, every government honor, she reminded the world that being written off as hopeless was not the end of a story, but sometimes the very beginning. Her greatest triumph came quietly, away from the cameras, walking back into the same hospital where she had once been a child on a bench, and seeing her mother's photo hung in the Staff Hall of Honor, not as a token, but as recognition of decades of unseen labor. Amara touched the frame gently, her own reflection overlapping with her mother's smile, and whispered that the vow she had carried since childhood had finally been kept. But history is not built on a single vow. It grows in ripples, and soon those ripples became waves. Universities created new programs in her name, training young scientists from backgrounds once excluded, emphasizing that brilliance was not the monopoly of privilege. Medical boards revised their protocols, creating emergency pathways for community-led innovations, acknowledging that bureaucracy should never again stand between a cure and the people who needed it. And perhaps most remarkably, hospitals began to retire the word hopeless from their charts, replacing it with continuing care, a symbolic but powerful shift that Amara herself called the deletion of despair. 2 years after her discovery, Amara stood in a crowded auditorium at the World Health Summit, the same summit that had once refused her student application for lack of funding, and looked out at leaders, scientists, and activists from every corner of the globe. She did not use slides or graphs. She spoke from memory, weaving her father's story into the larger story of every patient who had ever been told their life was not worth the fight. "Hope," she said, her voice steady, "is not a luxury to be rationed. It is the foundation of medicine. Without it, we are technicians, not healers." The applause thundered, echoing off the walls, But the moment that stayed with her was afterwards, when a young girl with braids approached shyly, clutching a notebook filled with equations, and whispered, "I want to be like you." Amara bent down, pressed the girl's hands around the notebook, and said, "No, be better than me." The girl nodded fiercely, and in that instant Amara knew the story had only just begun. Because her father's death had once been called hopeless, and because she had turned that word into a promise, millions now carried forward a new definition. That hopeless was never final. That hopeless was simply the space before courage stepped in. That hopeless was the seed of history.